Let me first raise a question to the panelists that came out in the presentations, and that is the extent to which society is or isn't really putting serious pressure on these states to do things. Prerna presented a picture of Chinese society as voluntaristic, as identifying with the state, as relatively easy to mobilize for mass campaigns. Devesh gave us kind of the opposite side of the coin, that they're out there rioting left and right, whereas Indians seem relatively quiescent by comparison. And I'm wondering how much you see local either social unrest or social support in some ways as pressuring the state to respond and therefore provide welfare systems or develop its capacity for controlling local societies. So you've talked, all of you, a good deal about the state, but not really too much about society here. And I'm wondering to what extent you see this as presenting real kinds of pressures, either on local governments or on the central state, to pressure local governments to deal with these kinds of social issues.
I think in the Indian case, one is seeing several different currents. One is, I think there's a huge generational shift that's happening. Younger people, and because of the nature of India's demographics, the population is very young. And one of the things we are seeing, in surveys, even in remote parts, rural India, is an incredible aspiration revolution. Whether it's the demand for private education, all sorts of things. A lot of that demand is being expressed through and is like an exit, but the demand is on private sector, meaning you don't feel the state is able to respond. So there are lots of entrepreneurs in the Indian system, poor, crappy, that doesn't matter. The fact is it is there. So you find that in a sense it's a voice and exit option. Your voice you sometimes feel is muted, so you're taking the exit option, and that is happening all across. The middle classes are doing that, but even the poor are. But interestingly enough, civil society itself has been making demands on the state. In particular, has been the driver for social legislation. It's not come through mass movements. It's not even come through mass politics. I mean, some of the most landmark social legislation, the reservations like for women in local governments that was passed in the 90s. It was done by really a tiny group of elite like women and men in Delhi. There was no mass demand. The Right to Education Act, there was no mass. So these social legislations are coming at the top from certain elites from civil society pressing in Delhi. Now, it is, however, not clear, because the Indian state, as I tried to make, is not been that bad in its intentions. The gap has been in the implementation of those intentions, and that I'm not yet clear is if the implementation continues to be weak, if the public will essentially continue to exit, de facto from public services.
I actually agree with everything Devesh has said. To this point that you said, that I mentioned that, and in this kind of very hack historical way, that there seems to be, at least relative to India, a greater willingness of society to mobilize, or a greater ability of the state to mobilize society, while Devesh presents this evidence that riots are increasing. Now, I would like to say that I don't think of those as necessarily contradictory. And actually, the reason why I say this is actually Lily's recent work. And so if I kind of understand this rise in riots in terms terms of the fact that so Professor Tsai's recent work has shown that even when people in China violate a law, when actually asked why is it that they're violating the law, they seem to think that this is because they actually want to show the regime the folly of its ways. So they don't actually want to challenge the regime. So if you kind of reinterpret the increase in riots as not necessarily a challenge to the state, but in a way a kind of a way for society to kind of tell the state this is a problem and this is something that needs to be rectified, then again to me this is kind of generally I guess emblematic of a different kind of state-society relation, which might broadly be characterized as something of a synergy. While in India, just as Devesh mentioned, there hasn't been mass mobilization even for the progressive social legislation that has been enacted since the early 2000s. And so I would argue the fact that in India that there are no riots is actually is not a good thing necessarily. It's actually just another indicator of the fact that there is this gulf between state and society, in which not only has society not really mobilized for state aims, but really hasn't, for whatever reason, even kind of felt the need to kind of mobilize to make the state aware of its needs or desires or aspirations, which, as Devesh rightly pointed out, are increasing. So I don't think of those as necessarily contradictory.
Yes, in the case I was talking about, I mean, you can think of, as people usually do when looking at workers in China, that you've got the old SOE Rust Belt workers, as C.K. Lee calls them, and then the migrant or Sun Belt workers in the dynamic export production zones. And both, of course, pressuring in different ways the local government. But the other actor that is so important in this case is the central government, that to the extent that protests become unruly, that they go beyond some specific problem within the firm to become citywide, then the local government knows that this will result in serious problems, not just for them, but for their individual careers. And so there is a need and a desire to want to solve these problems so that the central government doesn't punish them in terms of withholding promotions and other kinds of things. So there's a three-level dynamic there that's very important. But the other thing I would add to this is when we talk about protests over land grabs or unpaid wages or any of these other protests that we see so many of in China today, the question in my mind is whether, I mean, it seems to me that the Chinese government is saying, okay, we've got to do something about this. We've got to have policies that reduce inequality. But are these protests, are they driven by inequality concerns or other kinds of concerns about general social justice or these sorts of things? There's this very comprehensive survey by Marty White, of course, who seems to say, well, Chinese citizens, urban and rural, have a high tolerance for inequality as derived from market risks and so forth. And so I want to look further at how these protests are actions that are driven by inequality concerns and whether the central government's responses to them will ever do something like reducing the various forms of inequality that exist.
Yeah, so, your question is society putting any pressure on these states to do things? I mean, I think that based on my work in rural China and my reading of the literature on accountability for basic education and public goods provision in India, which I've looked at because I'm actually looking at accountability for basic education in Kenya, I mean, it's pretty clear that most people don't do anything. So most people don't put pressure on the government for various reasons. One of the key, or two of the key bottlenecks seem to be, one, they don't feel that it's their responsibility to do so. So, the responsibility for basic public goods provision is an external actor, whether that's the government or a non-governmental actor. But it's not my problem. It's not my responsibility. I care about it, but it's not my responsibility to do something. Another bottleneck seems to be a sense that it grows out of low state capacity, that ordinary people at least perceive the state as having low state capacity. Even if they did something, it would be pointless. So the state is already either too corrupt or doesn't care enough about doing something. So then the question to me becomes, so who does put pressure on the state? Most people don't. Who does? and why. And my answer to this question comes out of a paper that I'm working on with harvard-yenching, where we find that surprisingly, it's not the people outside the system, the disenfranchised people outside the system, that are more likely to complain to government officials. It's what we call political insiders. So in the countryside, it turns out to be party members. So party members are more likely than non-party members to complain to the government about local public goods provision. In urban China, it turns out that it's people who have relatives who are higher level officials who are more likely to complain. But either way, there are different forms of political insiders for urban and rural China, but either way, it's the political insiders that are more likely to complain. But then the question is whether they are putting pressure on the state or whether they are giving information to the state, right? Putting pressure means that you have some sort of leverage over the state, which is not at all clear to me that they do. I would interpret their action. I'd be more inclined to interpret their actions as giving information to state agents who are actually inclined to listen, right? Because as Yasheng has talked about in his own work, the Chinese state anyway, and I think I would guess the Indian state finds it very difficult to obtain accurate information about what's going on at grassroots level. They are actually trying to get accurate information about what's going on. The statisticians are incredibly underpaid, not well trained necessarily. Moreover, information is filtered and distorted at every level. So in a lot of cases, when people are complaining, the state is actually getting really useful information that they are actually inclined to act on. So, but I don't think that's pressure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Can you identify yourself, please?
Jay Schwartz. I'm a writer. I'm from Somerville. Question pertains to wages, their adequacy, particularly in China, the so-called declining wage spiral, and the presumption. It's a series of a few linked questions. One is not the Chinese government somehow responsible for the low levels of wages? Low levels of wages in China, which constitutes a major comparative advantage that China enjoys. That is to say, have people been deliberately or inadvertently or semi-deliberately driven off the land so as to enter the urban proletariat? And the surplus of people in the urban proletariat ensuring lower wages in China, thereby driving Chinese economic growth. And then finally, what is the adequacy of Chinese labor, taking into consideration, for example, the Mike Daisy fictional report about Foxconn. You know about Foxconn. This was a fictional thing, and it was clearly an impressionistic thing. Okay, so that's my question. If some of you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it. Thanks very much.